This series of 9 videos is about our vacation to Yellowstone in 2017. Part 2 took us to the Geyser Basins in the southwest part of the park loop on September 15th. Our morning started with the discovery of just how abundant the bison are in the park. After being nearly hunted to extinction, they are now doing quite well in Yellowstone. This area is just north of the lower Geyser Basin, which you can see in the background. We had planned on going back to the Old Faithful area and exploring the upper Geyser Basin. We did for a little bit and saw some of the features on Geyser Hill as the rain-snow mix was falling. We were also introduced to the bacterial mats that can be found at most of the hydrothermal features in the park. But between rain, cold, and too much camera equipment, we decided to modify our plans. The area right by our campground is home to one of the early structures of the park with a great view of National Park Mountain. Back in our campground itself, we became even more aware of the presence of the bison in the park. After regrouping, we headed back towards the Geyser Basins. This time we decided to take the short detour along Firehole Canyon Drive. We saw Firehole Falls, and one of just 2 swimming areas in the park, which by this point has been warmed up some from all of the runoff from the Geyser Basins upstream. But it was cold outside, so none of us got in. I could see how tempting it would be if the air was warmer though. When we got back to the upper Geyser Basin, we decided not to start with the Old Faithful area again, but to check out Biscuit Basin. This is where I first started to be fascinated by all the different forms and colors the bacterial communities create. We also learned that patience and luck determined whether we would see a geyser erupt or not. Sometimes we would walk up to a geyser and it would seem dormant. But if we waited just a minute, sometimes we would get lucky and see it get active. Many features were fascinating even if they weren't active. Shell Springs biscuit-like formations exemplify where Biscuit Basin got its name. Alcova didn't have much in the way of biscuit-like features, but it was interesting in its own way. Mustard Spring is kind of typical of the lesser-known springs in the park. Not as spectacular as some, but if it was located anywhere else in the country, it would be a highlight. Look closely at some of the smaller features and they can be gorgeous. Lichens turned out to be an unexpected addition to the beauty of the park. After Biscuit Basin, we hit Black Sand Basin, where Cliff Geyser was a star. There is evidence that bison get pretty close to some of the springs. Emerald Pool was made up of a variety of colors of greens, not just emerald. The next stop was Fountain Paint Pots. We weren't quite sure how to walk slippery, even though we were wet, but we decided to go ahead down the trail anyway. Clepsydra Geyser was active, even though the steam and haze made it difficult to see. Red Spouter is a relatively new feature to the park. It did not even exist until 1959, when the Hebgen Lake earthquake hit. The Fountain Paint Pots area was named for its hydrothermal features resembling boiling pots of mud. Someone either came up with the clever euphemism of paint for the way they looked, or they really thought they resembled paint if it was to boil. These were the first mud pots we would see, but they would not be the last. They quickly became one of my favorite types of features. Silex Spring had some intricate edges to it and was more visible overall than many features since we entered the park. The cold air causes more visible steam coming off the hot water than if it was a warmer, sunnier day. The next stop was Firehole Lake Drive. Firehole Spring was another very colorful feature. Surprise Pool provided us with the closest thing to a bear we would see on the trip. If you don't see it, the mouth is on the left. Great Fountain Geyser has formed a small terrace around it, over which water flows in places. When we got to White Dome Geyser, the people who were already there seemed confident that it would erupt soon, so we waited a while. While we were waiting, the sun started trying to come out. It was nice to see the lighting on the feature change, but it never did erupt during the 30 minutes or so that we waited, so we moved on. At Firehole Lake, we saw Young Hopeful Geyser, and the Black Warrior Springs area. The different bacteria and algae that inhabit the runoff channels of hot springs can be mesmerizing. We saw completely different kinds of lichens than the ones at Biscuit Basin. Then we left the Firehole Lake area. Our last stop for the day was Grand Prismatic Spring. A lot of water flows from the pools in the area and into the Firehole River. We had been fighting fog all day, which made for some cool pictures but made viewing the features almost impossible in places. Like this is Grand Prismatic Spring, one of the most well-known and beautiful features in the park, but we couldn't see it. What we could see were the bacterial mats all around the boardwalk. Even when the conditions are better, you can't really get a good appreciation for Grand Prismatic from the boardwalk. The best view is from above. We planned to get that view in a couple of days when the weather was supposed to improve. For now, we focused on the details we could see. We saw more evidence that bison get close to the springs in the park and can apparently tolerate a certain level of heat on their feet. Excelsior Geyser used to have such massive eruptions that it carved out a crater around it. Now it is rarely active as a geyser, but it still pours 4,000 gallons of hot water into the Firehole River every minute. Z was very impressed. In an attempt to deal with the rain, we visited 5 boardwalks and 2 side drives on this day. We ended our day overlooking the Midway Geyser Basin. Part 3 takes us to the Norris Geyser Basin and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone.